Dear listeners, welcome at this 7th episode of the Meet the Expert podcast series. And in this series, Meet the Expert, together with well-known experts from around the globe, we explore challenges and opportunities in the big veterinary world. And in this episode, we're going to talk about a virus that is well known to me, African swine fever virus, and in more detail, we're going to zoom in on the situation in Vietnam and how they've been trying to get the virus under control. We'll have special attention for the so-called tooth extraction method, a strategy to block the spread of the virus. The Meet the Expert podcast series is a co-production of Boehringer Ingelheim Animal Health and Pig Progress. My name is Vincent de Beek, I'm editor for Pig Progress, and I am the host of today's episode. Today's guest is based in Duluth, Georgia, United States. As Dr. Christa Goodell, who obtained her DVM title from Kansas State University in the US, and she did her PhD at Iowa State University. And after various positions within the swine business, she became Global Technical Manager for Boehringer Ingelheim Animal Health. So, welcome, Christa. We're really happy to have you here.
Thank you, Vincent. Very glad to be here.
Excellent. And as we said, we are going to talk about the African swine fever situation in Vietnam. And perhaps as a start, it is good to go over the situation there a little bit, because how is the situation with African swine fever there? Well, as is well known, Vietnam is known for its predilection for pigs. So after China, it was the country being home to most pigs in Asia. And in the last census before ASF in 2018, the FAO figures the country had 28.2 million pigs. First ASF outbreaks were reported in Vietnam in 2019, and the virus quickly swept through the entire country. All 63 provinces confirmed presence of the virus. Farms as well as smallholders were affected strongly, and based on the FAO figures, Vietnam lost at least 30% of its pig herd due to ASF. Then in 2019, the pig numbers were down to 19.6 million. And at the moment, Vietnam is well on the way to rebuild its industry, with more attention than ever for biosecurity and pig health. And according to the data from the Vietnamese Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, the pig inventory level in 2021 was back at 28 million pigs. And the entire world are currently watching how Vietnam is doing with the first round of vaccinations in various provinces against African swine fever virus. That doesn't mean that the virus is completely gone, because against the image of a rebuilding industry is also the notion that the virus has still been detected in 47 provinces at least this year. So knowing where the virus is and knowing how to deal with it is still essential. And this is where the research of Dr. Goodell comes in. So, Dr. Goodell, back to you. You spoke about African swine fever at the recent International Pig Veterinary Society Congress in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, held in June. In this podcast, we've spent attention to the tooth extraction method as a strategy to overcome an ASF infection. I think after this long introduction, you might want to explain what is that all about.
Sure, I can sure do that. So the tooth extraction method is an interesting term, of course, actually. And I believe that it comes from a translation of the Chinese term that actually means to remove an infected animal after clinical signs are detected. And I think we can back up a little bit. When the China African swine fever outbreak happened, there was devastation, right? We had millions of pigs being culled, and the swine industry in China was, I think 40% was a term that a number that I've seen. They've lost about 40% of the herd at that time. So when we look at African swine fever and we look at the standard protocols for control and elimination, most of them use full depop, repop. And so when a herd is positive and the herd is culled and then repopulated, if you're losing 30%, 40% of your entire Chinese swine population in the swine industry, you're not going to have a lot of pigs in farms or even to replace them. And so this was very quickly determined that, necessity is the mother of invention. If they can't cull entire herds, what might be the next best option. We do know that African swine fever is a very slow transmitting virus. There are all sorts of things that our study learned that is supporting the evidence that it doesn't mean it's not present. It just may not be clinically present. And so the necessity was, rather than removing 100% of the herds and replacing them, what is the likelihood that you can remove the virus if you identify a clinical animal, and with the suspicion that the most at-risk animals would be the neighbor on the left and the right of that animal in a sow farm we're talking about, that then became the tooth extraction method. So typically it was the animal that was sick as well as her neighbor on either side. It became modified to maybe 2 animals on either side. And that was technically what was then published or publicized as the tooth extraction method. Now, what also was shared was at the beginning of this that had variable success. I mean, it had between 30 and 80% success rates. And so that really was one of the questions we wanted to understand. Was these numbers seem arbitrary, right? So if you're looking at a clinical animal and you only take the animals next to her, what is the likelihood that you actually may not be removing all of the African swine fever in that farm?
Yeah, when you talk about 30 to 80% success rate, does success rate mean that it totally worked on that farm, or does that mean that on that particular site the virus was gone? How did they define that, or is that also?
Yep. And that's a very good point. Again, there were several different reports and presentations for groups that would go into China and then come back and report at our AASVs and those sorts of things in our professional meetings. And what was determined was that if clinical signs were not repeated, and again, their time frame may have been 6 months, their time frame may have been a year, but it all depended on what they were reporting as a time frame of continued negative or no clinical signs reported. That was what determined success rate. Now, I can tell you that if African swine fever was not removed from the farm, you're going to see clinical signs within the next weeks, right? So it probably wasn't hard to determine that success rate didn't work, or that it was working if, 6 months later, a year later, you don't have signs of clinical ASF and you haven't tested positives on a diagnostic test.
And did they just remove anything that looked particularly sick, or because you can also just remove an unlucky animal that wouldn't have spread anything, it was just in a bad state?
Right. Yes, absolutely. And we actually found that in our study as well. So the thing with the tooth extraction method, which now is more better termed a partial depopulation. I think new terms are precision removal. That's a term that I'm hearing currently. Targeted depopulation.
Mm-hmm.
I think what was reported and what continues to be reported when you have successes. So I think if you ask some of the teams that are consulting in China what is working, they would say that this is actually working in farms where they are absolutely addressing clinical signs immediately, and then they're testing a significant number of animals, possibly even in a whole herd. So you will increase your success rate if you do more testing, removing animals that you may not physically see as clinical. But you're absolutely right. They would err on the side of caution. The less success they had, then they would end up changing their protocol to say, we're going to remove more animals in hopes that we would be removing animals that may be harboring African swine fever, but not necessarily clinical yet.
Yeah. So addressing immediately as well as testing a lot, those are two components that may lead to success for this. So, but yeah, if it means that a large part of the herd can continue to live, I think that clearly shows the importance of this type of research.
Correct, correct. And so our research really wanted to understand what might be missed, right? So if we're making assumptions about which animals should be removed, and then we're arbitrarily just choosing the animals right around that sow, it's possible that we aren't really considering how African swine fever may have come into the farm, right? We might not be considering the origin of that transmission. And so we, in our study, decided we assumed that there was a water trough, a common water trough in these sow farms, which we ultimately found was not the case. But that's what based our hey, if we looked at that animal that was clinical, rather than assuming one animal on either side, we thought if we looked for additional animals up the trough and 10 additional animals down the trough, again, with the assumption that we have a common water trough, what might we find if you tested all of those animals? So rather than testing the animal right next to that clinical animal, we tested 14 animals close to that clinical sow, and we had very revealing results.
Briefly, could you explain how the test was, how the trial was set up, as you would?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So, what this study was a collaboration that was funded by SHIC, the Swine Health Improvement Center, and the collaboration was between the Nang Lam University in Vietnam. It also collaborated with the Bering Ingelheim veterinarians that lived in Vietnam, as well as producers that were willing to enroll in this project. And so, we in the U.S. would support with knowledge and some tests also that we sent to Vietnam. But the collaboration was completely boots on the ground in Vietnam with the university, the producers, and the veterinarians doing all of that legwork. So it was really phenomenal to me in 2020 when most of us were unable to travel because of COVID, et cetera. We made this.
You
work.
never made it to Vietnam, then I
didn't.
understand.
No, I didn't. But we made the study work, which is to me a great activity, a great event.
So it was a masterpiece of coordination and
Yes.
delegation, so to say, all the time.
Correct, and communication, right? So we all were communicating all the time to make sure that no balls were dropped, but also that people had what they needed.
Excellent. Please continue. Yeah.
So our study was based on the detection of clinical signs. So we would say that it was a suspected African swine fever event that was from the caregivers at the sow farm. So this was really an identification at the sow farm level by laypersons on animals that were exhibiting classic or you say clinical signs of fever, off feed, abortions, reddening of the skin, the piglets that were not doing well, etc. But you know that those are also clinical signs of PRRS and classical swine fever, which Vietnam also has. So the identification of a suspected animal is what triggers the event. And then when our team was contacted, the team went in and assisted with the bleeding of those the clinical animal herself, and then 4 animals up and 10 animals down from her position in the this what do you call it, snake or gestation. But that was the collection of those samples. They were returned to the laboratory, and within 24 hours, using an OIE reference PCR, those results were reported back to the farm.
Mm-hmm. And then you would quickly figure out sometimes it wouldn't be African swine fever at all, and sometimes it would.
Correct. And actually, with those 52 events that we collected samples at, 33% of them were not African swine fever. None of the 15 samples that were collected at those farms. So that also is an indication of you can't assume, right? You can't assume, and if you were to remove animals 100% of the time, 33% of that you'd be removing animals that wouldn't need to be. And in our study, we found that one of the reasons that farms were believing that this was African swine fever is that they were using commercial point-of-care tests, the lateral flow test, because they don't really have access to laboratories and good diagnostics. And so we do have to take into account that there are low-sensitive tests, low-specific as well, but low-sensitive tests that are being used. In this case, if they're giving false positives, that would be a specificity issue. And so we have to in one of the conclusions we have is really support at the producer level better and better quality diagnostics in these events of detecting clinical animals, but really getting good diagnostics in PCRs that will give them the results to understand, yes, is it a true African swine fever or not?
It's easier said than done, I think.
Absolutely, and in some of these rural places, we had samples from northern, central, and southern Vietnam, and yes, some of them are very rural. We had farms that were, they were non-walled farms. They were open to the outdoors. We had farms that were less than 200 sows. We also had farms in our study that were 4,800 sows. Right, so we had all sorts of a variety represented in this study to me, which was again fantastic. But it goes to show you that in some of these rural places, they don't have access to these diagnostics. And so, what can we do to help them and support them?
Yeah, 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 yeah. And then there is also, I suppose, a cultural and language difference that all these things also need to be bridged in order to make things work.
Right, and that's a really great point, Vincent. So one of the things that we came up, our study lasted over a year to collect those 52 events, and one of the reasons was that a producer assumed that we were going to go in, test the clinical animal, test the two neighbors on either side, and when we went in and said we want to test 15 animals, they said, no, we don't want you because of COVID and because they didn't want African swine. They were worried that there could be other transmission. And so there were some significant barriers that when we actually came into the situation, it became a little more difficult because of those things that you were just mentioning.
Yeah, I can imagine that. If I go fast forward to your conclusion, you mentioned that the tooth extraction method, or as you said, a partial depopulation, was not sufficient to eliminate African swine fever virus from a sow farmer. What results made you think that way? Okay, that this method is not exact enough, or doesn't generate a sufficient amount of results that you think, okay, this is a safe method to go by.
Right. So the question we really were very clearly proving was that so we had animals 66% of the time, so 33% they were not positive, but 66% they were positive. And when you look at the distribution of where those positives were, of course, about 45%, maybe 50% were within one and two animals from that clinical south. But in the end, we had 45%, over 45% beyond those sows. And so if you
Yeah. So
think about it,
you can say in that way that the tooth extraction method does work to a certain extent, but it is definitely not a method to say we definitely will always get it under control.
exactly. And that kind of
Yeah.
gets back to our original thought of, well, when you have such variable success ranging from, 25, 30% all the way up to 80%, now you can understand, oh, how does that happen? Well, sometimes you're lucky. Sometimes you're lucky and it's just those two or three animals, but most often you're not, right? So 30% of the time in our study, over 30% of the time, there was a positive, even if you remove those four animals. And so it was very interesting for us to look at that and then to say maybe the conclusion should be, in addition to it, more testing. Um, Focusing more on the events that have been occurring in that farm that could have brought the virus in. So one of the things that we did was we surveyed the farms for I've got a list here, their location, their sow herd size, the type of facility, whether it was open or enclosed, whether or not they'd had a previous outbreak. And then the last one, the first clinical signs appeared less than or greater than 7 days. And when you look at all of those descriptive data, the interesting thing is, although some of them were confounded, some of the small farms were located in individual regions, right? So there aren't always all small farms all over, and there aren't always big farms all over. But what we found that was very clear was that for those farms that identified and tested and were able to make actions within 7 days of detecting that clinical sign, they were significantly more likely to have fewer positive animals. On the other side, those farms that were actually identifying after they were identifying and then calling us after a week, so the clinical signs had been in that farm, those farms were over 3 times more likely to have more sows positive in their herd. So another conclusion that we came from our study was that early identification and early implementation of your activity, the earliest you can do that, the more likely it is that you actually will be successful to remove African swine fever. And again, I think part of that is doing your investigation to understand, hey, what were we doing a week ago, 10 days ago? What were the things that we could have had moving in, bringing African swine fever in? And then, of course, testing more animals, right? So that's part of the thing that we do have to either overcome or offer alternatives to these more rural locations that don't have access to a laboratory within a couple hours.
I see, I see. So basically the tooth extraction method, you can help it to be more successful also by being quick, by being transparent, I suppose. I've used that word quite often because transparency, I think, is also something that makes a hell of a difference if you can, whether it can work or not.
Right.
And then also testing, as you say.
Yes, I actually have recently read a report from China. Again, China's been at this a few years now, right? So I think they have perfected it, and they don't want to have depops, total depops. They want to be successful. And what I'm reading is that when they have a clinical animal detected, they're testing 100% of the animals in that barn immediately, 100% of the animals. And some of those farms in China are not small. Right. So we're talking about the understanding of what diagnostics bring to, ASF control. And again, like you said, the immediacy of, hey, we acknowledge we've got a problem. We need to dive in and get some testing done so that it's a smaller problem than what could happen if we wait.
Would you say that the tooth extraction method is, well, would you consider it better than nothing if there is no other tools available, or would you not recommend it in any way?
So I think that it has to be coupled with what are you going to do about it, right? We have to get those diagnostics done. We have to be testing on a more routine basis. What we found was, and again, with the data that I just shared with you, the vast majority of these animals are not clinical. The vast majority, right? So we had in 86 total positive samples, we had 35 of them as the indicator, as the single clinical animal. All the rest were not. So the majority of the animals are not clinical when you actually have that first clinical. And that's why, to me, there's a lower success rate, because your assumption is as soon as the animal gets African swine fever, they get clinical, and that's not a fair assumption. They're going to harbor the virus and shed the virus. That's the part, is they're still going to shed even though they're not clinical. So diving in, doing the diagnostics, but you're already behind the 8 ball once you have your first clinical animal. And again, part of the challenge in Vietnam when we talk about tooth extraction is, are you going to test 100% of the animal? Who's going to pay for that? How soon can you get those diagnostics to the laboratory? And is that test going to be a quality test? Has the sample been handled appropriately? Has it stayed cold? We're talking about tropical environments, and that's not what we need to do with blood. So there are all sorts of things that we really need to put in place to allow this partial depop or precision removal to be successful. But do I think that it's going to work without it? I don't. I think that we're still going to have very varied responses and very variable success rates. And so I think that we have to support the whole process of how are we going to eliminate African swine fever from the farms? Not just remove animals, but eliminate, make them successful programs.
I think, as you say, that there is a lot of difference between what sounds probably the right thing to do in theory and practice in the field. I think, as you say, the temperature, cultural differences, will samples stay cold indeed? All these kinds of things. Okay, you want them to be effective, but whether or not it happens in practice is a different question.
Right. Yep.
You briefly mentioned just now that African swine fever virus DNA was detected sometimes here, and the animals were not clinical. Does that mean that pigs could contract the virus without actually getting sick? Or were these just animals who had just contracted the virus and were on their way to becoming sick?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. We actually know that we are dealing with type 2 African swine fever. It's the Georgia strain that's over in Southeast Asia as well as China. And so we know that it's got a very high mortality rate, right? It's a very slow transmitting virus, but ultimately we've seen mortalities between 90 and 100% depending on the age and the population. Now, in saying that, we know it's not always 100%, right? So we know that there are animals that are surviving. And we know that the more we have African swine fever staying in a country or staying in farms, we can actually have the virus changing and adapting and animals doing the same, right? So it is quite possible that you can create populations that may become immune, although chronically infected and or having chronic debilitations, right? Low growth rates, et
I
cetera.
was going to say there is a difference between not having a problem and surviving.
Correct, absolutely. And I think what we identified, because the majority of our farms were first events, they were events that I think we had rebreaks in only 6 of the systems, and 46 of them were new. So, in the end, do I think that animals eventually will become clinical? Yes, I do. I think the vast majority, when you are talking about an outbreak with this particular virus, is very it's a lethal virus for the most part, but I think we have to be very careful to assume it will always be that way, which is why I worry that if we assume that African swine fever elimination can be slow, I think that will end up biting us. I think that we could end up with animals that can maintain the virus. Obviously, we can have sows farrowing piglets and providing maternal antibodies if she actually was infected. And so, can we have a piglet that's got maternal antibodies be infected and then not succumb to the virus? I think that's possible too. So, I think we could be setting ourselves up for endemicity and survival, right? Rather than 100% mortality, which again is the urgency to understand how we can have a better success rate in cleaning up these farms.
Yeah, and in that sense, yeah, you will only find out that an animal is positive by doing the testing. Indeed.
Correct.
What has been the result on the ground in Vietnam for you? Have the recommendations and the outcome of the research led to a different approach of trying to detect the presence of African swine fever? Do you feel?
So I think that China has come a long way. I think that China actually realizes, and again, there's a lot of support, there's a lot of funding, and of course, the value of pork went really high, right? When we didn't have a lot of pigs, there's a lot of money to be made in saving animals, and those farms that actually had pigs survive probably made a lot of money. So in saying that, the investment in diagnostics probably had a large part to do with the current success, right? So if they're doing more testing and they're doing testing early, they're probably being very successful in eliminating the virus. Now, are they focusing on biosecurity? Are they focusing on the things that will keep ASF out? We have to always be hounding on that and always be understanding if our best practices on biosecurity are being managed and implemented the way we want them to be on an everyday. Are we there in Vietnam? I don't think so. And I think that's part of it, because who's investing in the diagnostics, right? If a producer has to pay to test all of his animals, that's not going to happen. Part of our study was also to look at point of care tests. As I mentioned, the lateral flow tests were just not sufficient on specificity or sensitivity, but we also tested 3 commercial PCR point of care tests. And the interesting thing was actually all 3 of those were very good, since had very good sensitivity and specificity in the clinical situation. So they were very high, it was 98%, as we would expect on a PCR, for detecting that clinical animal as positive. But again, where we failed was when we compared the test results of the point of care PCRs to that reference laboratory, the OIE test, they fell off when we started getting non-clinical animals. Right. So when we had non-clinical animals, and oh, by the way, when they're non-clinical, they probably have less virus, which is what, again, our study showed. We had CT values much higher in the non-clinical animals that's when the PCRs weren't as sensitive either. So the PCRs were not picking up the positives as easily if they weren't clinical. So that gets to the point of we can use these point of care PCRs because, again, it allows us at least to do diagnostics at the farm level. But we have to be careful because I don't think that they're going to be helpful at all for elimination programs. They might tell you if this particular animal is positive, but you're again behind the eight ball if you're waiting until an animal's positive, because then you know that it's in your farm and it very well could be in other animals that just aren't clinical yet. So again, it's that balance of understanding, do we have the right tools to get to the producers in those locations that are, and again, that are good quality tools? And maybe how can we get some of these laboratories, maybe satellite sites, right? It's like, how can we support and get it more local so that the testing can get done and results can get returned in a timely fashion, and we know that there's quality behind them and that the sample has been handled well as well. So
I see. But at least the point of care PCR test could be an additional tool, if not used to give total 100% clarity about the situation.
Right. And I think that's probably where people need to start is right now, if we don't have the ability to test it all, well, the majority of your herd may go positive, right? So like we said, if you can't identify it and do something within 7 days, you're going to have a lot more positives. So maybe it does get you that first step, but I think helping the country plan and then get access to, okay, now what, right? Once you have people that are realizing, oh, ASF is a bad thing, I'm going to end up losing my entire farm, then the investments of understanding how do we get better lab testing, closer laboratories, or a more efficient way of getting samples to the laboratory. I think that all is part of how the next wave of collaboration is going to help with the success of ASF elimination in those Southeast Asian countries.
Okay, that makes all sense. I have one more question. That's actually, is there any follow-up research planned, or is there any plans to kind of make more steps and develop diagnostics methods even better in Vietnam? Is there something going on at the moment?
I think that there's with the African swine fever vaccine that is currently being proposed and implemented in a small trial. I think with the U.S. and Philippines work that's being done, I think there's only a very short amount of time between the value of understanding the value of collaborating with Vietnam to learn more, to have more access to doing the right thing with testing and diagnostics. I'm not aware of some of those studies, but I know there's a lot of activity. And again, Vietnam is very interested in being successful in eliminating African swine fever. Protein number one is pork, right? Just like in China. So they want to be successful. The countries that don't have ASF want to help. They want to learn. And so, yes, I think there's going to be, and currently is probably a lot of work, boots on the ground, and there's just a lot of activity.
Yeah, I can imagine. The last question I had for myself is, what's the interest of Boehringer Ingelheim to be involved in this kind of research?
So Boehringer Ingelheim is a knowledge leader, right? So we don't have a product, we don't have diagnostics, but we sure as heck want to help the producers. We want to help the industry. And the really neat thing about it was we said, hey, can we do this study? We have producers, we have a veterinary team, we had links with, like I said, Nang Long University, and it all worked, and we were funded, and it was fantastic. So to me, Boehringer Ingelheim wants to support these industries that need help. Even though we may not have a foot in the game, we absolutely are supporting the industry and the people that are in the pork system. So to me, it was really. Not only was it successful, but I really appreciated it. It was very gratifying to be able to work with such talented and dedicated people. So yeah, I appreciate BI's funding of it as well.
Yeah, I could imagine as well that it helps to understand the virus a little bit better, especially that, the virus is not in the United States, is, hopefully not very strongly in Germany, apart from the Eastern Germany in the wild boar. But that actually, the more you can know about how the virus behaves, then it is not just some kind of a far away virus, but you've actually looked at it and looked it in the eye, so to say.
Right. Yep. And I think that, again, biosecurity is this Pandora's box right now. And we all want to understand, how is it getting to these farms? Because animals aren't getting sick within 2 days. Sometimes it's 10 days. Sometimes it's just one animal, and it takes a month until it's, half the farm. And so really understanding from the very beginning and being able to have those questions and investigations on biosecurity is also going to be a huge impetus here in the future.
You can see that with COVID, I think we're still learning about how the virus actually transmits and how it behaves. Okay, I think I have asked all my questions. Did I forget anything, or was there anything that you wish to add?
I think that we've covered, the high points of the study. I think that the collaboration again was really phenomenal. We had Professor Chuan's and Professor Dewey's laboratories and their research associates in the Nang Lam University. Again, our veterinarians on the ground and the producers in Vietnam that collaborated. I can't thank everyone enough. And I think that this is only the beginning of how we work together to solve problems, right? And I think it was really a great example of that.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you very much, Dr. Goodell. And I think it helped us to cast more light on a still mysterious threat, I think, for the international swine industry. I'd like to thank you having you on the podcast. Quick look ahead, because in the next episode we shall be talking about pig welfare. Totally different subject, but very exciting, and one with a lot of animal health angles, as you will learn. So make sure not to miss that one. We look forward to having you all present. For now, thank you for listening. Thank you, Dr. Goodell, for her presence, and good luck with everything that you're going to do in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent. I had a wonderful time. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.